Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this CJCM webinar. During the month of April and May, we are developing a CJCM policy on the rights of nature and natural climate solutions for South Africa to address the worsening climate crisis. We continue to invite activists to work with us in this process and to send inputs to cjcm@mweb.co.za. This webinar, which is entitled Advancing Rights of Nature and Human Rights in Africa and Beyond, is in this context of developing a rights of nature and natural climate solutions policy for South Africa, based, of course, on the principles of the Climate Justice Charter. We are honored today to have our great panelists with us. We have Lucy, Mulenkei, Pooven, Moodley, and we also have Amelia Heyns. Each one of our panelists is going to present for 15 minutes, and then after they've presented for 15 minutes, I'm going to open it up to all our attendees to engage with us. Lucy Mulenkei, who's going to go first, has over 20 years of experience in journalism, training, and is the executive director of the Indigenous Information Network. She has been building a network of almost 100 grassroots organizations in Africa. Lucy is part of the Maasai indigenous community in Kenya, and her expertise lie in the sustainable development of Kenya's indigenous pastoralist communities. She has coordinated sustainable development training and capacity building for indigenous, rural, nomadic, pastoralists, and hunter-gatherers that utilizes traditional knowledge and insights conversations on biodiversity. After Lucy, we'll have Amelia Heyns, who has been advocating for the empowerment of rural farming communities for many years. She holds experience as a human rights legal practitioner and in managing programs advancing these rights. She joined Natural Justice in 2020 as the program manager for the Standing on Communities Pragmatic Stream. Before joining Natural Justice, she managed the Ethical Trade Program at the Wine and Agriculture Ethical Trade Association. After Lucy, we'll have Pooven Moodley, who is a human rights lawyer and social justice activist from South Africa. He has a long history of activism from the anti-apartheid struggles to Oxfam and Action Aid International. He is presently the executive director of Natural Justice and most recently led with other activists a successful campaign for a just energy future to stop South Africa's proposed massive nuclear deal with the Russians against all odds. He continues to provide solidarity and support to activists across the globe. To all our panelists, thank you so much for making time to be with us today. Lucy Mulenkei, I will hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and also for my colleagues who are going to present. And to you participants, you are all welcome. I think this particular topic where we are talking about nature, advancing rights of nature and human rights in Africa and beyond is very, very important for us. And despite the fact that you've just mentioned that this is a discussion that is going to continue to be able to bring up some of the recommendations and some of the issues that are needed in Southern Africa, I think it will impact in the whole of Africa. And when we look at these discussions, especially where we are talking about nature, human rights, and biodiversity conservation, issues of climate change, we look at them holistically and see Africa as one. And that's what we want to really advance in different discussions. And we're also looking at who are the people we are talking to and how are we going to advance our work in terms of looking at advocacy, especially looking at issues of human rights, which you all know in Africa, when you mention them, they are always very sensitive. But we do believe that we have to continue speaking about them and really acting on them, because these are very important areas for us to be able to look at nature. We also know that climate change is really hitting us so badly, and we are losing quite a number of resources just because of bad policies. Policies are there, they're never implemented properly. It's not inclusive. It's not a human rights-based approach is not really used. And so we need to look at it and instead of complaining, see how we can be able to work together and bring these issues together and be able to manage and conserve and preserve and try to restore our ecosystems, and especially look at issues of biodiversity that has been lost. And we are discussing it at all levels. One of the important things that in all the years that I've been working with the issues of biodiversity conservation, looking at issues of Indigenous peoples and local communities, is that problem of that Indigenous peoples and local communities are not included. They are always excluded in terms of discussion, especially when we are discussing about different policies on environment. And that's why for us, discussing this and working with communities at all levels is very, very important, because they play a great role. In those lands where they are, where we are as Indigenous people, as local communities, are our lands, and we protect the environment quite clearly. We also play a virtual role in terms of looking at issues of nature. And that's why it's so important to make sure that at least the communities are fully involved. For the Indigenous communities, if you go right to the village, that nature is part of them. It's look at it holistically. It's the first thing that they would really grab to protect, because they know it has value for them. And when you are talking about nature and a right to nature, I think in advancing it for future generation, it's there right in the community. The community started mainstreaming different activities, different issues. It's right from the word go, long time ago. And you grow up with it. We grew up knowing that nature is very, very important, and everything that has life has a right as much as you have right, and that you have always to make sure that you protect it and you don't destroy it. And everything has a place of its own, and that place has to be also respected. And this is the nature down in the ground, down with the communities. And they know how to really make sure that they protect each and everything, and they also look at it. And in case of anyone destroying it, there is always traditionally the way one is punished, and also the way we are educated and creating awareness to make sure that we protect that nature, and we know that it has a right also to be where it is. So this is something from the ground, but science and maybe at the top level there, for years they have been imagining that it's the science that knows better than the Indigenous people, than the local communities and the people within the ground. But now we are glad that at least everything has come back to the ground for them to see. And I think issues of climate change has taught many of us quite a lot of issues, and many of other researchers and so on, to know that Indigenous people are really crucial in terms of looking after different species, different natural biodiversity. We have natural forest areas, seas, may it be on dry lands. All those areas are important. And that's why even when they are in the very extreme dry areas, the Kalahari, the Sahara, then the semi-arid lands of sub-Saharan Africa and all that, they really still protect their lands, and they believe that's their land. That is what God gave them, and they have to protect each and every single species. And of course, look at it to see how it can be restored. So these are the things that I really wanted to take ourselves back on the ground to look at it. And for Indigenous people, I also like the fact that we have been able in Africa to really get together and be able to discuss these particular issues and see how we can advance themselves. It's also great that we have partners, NGOs, that really support the issues of discussing different aspects, especially on the region, at the regional level, from the national level, regional level, and also at the international level, to be able to advance and to make our governments to understand some of these issues and their role, the vital role that Indigenous communities play in terms of conservation, and in terms of also advancing in restoring some of the important resources that we have. Because Africa, we are rich. We are extremely rich, and we have resources that we really need to protect. And these resources are our money, they are our gold mines. But we really need to look at them in a kind of a positive way, also look at it and see how can those who are already protecting them be able to be recognized and so on. We know very well that our government do put in some policies in place, and those policies in most of the countries, especially in Africa, have not been implemented. They are just somewhere in the shelves. Some of the communities don't even know that those particular policies exist. but it's very, very important to make sure that those particular communities are also included, and they are able to look at them and to be able to contribute and to be at the decision-making level also to contribute to that, because they know how those resources can be well restored and they can be well protected. Now, when we look at issues of biodiversity, which I'm supposed to talk about much more than that, generally telling about the importance of conservation and so on, our biodiversity, most of the countries in Africa actually were mega diverse countries, but we have seen them, phase out slowly by slowly. This is again because of lack of some of the strategies that are not put in place, some of the management and policies that are in place and are not implemented. And it's very important to know that it's very crucial to ensure that those policies, those discussions at different levels are very important to be put in place. Let's look at the Convention on Biological Diversity, where governments signed and also ratified in 1992, when the Earth Summit took place in Rio, and continuously were able to ratify as much as we went on. And today, with the over 170-something countries, 90-something countries who have already ratified the convention and having a lot of discussion in different levels, it's very important to see and to know how much Africa has been playing a role in different discussions that we've been having in our Convention on Biological Diversity. And I'm always proud of Africa because as time has come by, we've been able to see our government also try to think of issues that in about 10, 20 years back, we could not think about them. Working together with indigenous communities, with the other civil society groups, to be able to see what are the gaps that are there and how can we be able to really make sure that we bridge them and we can continue working and recognizing the very important role of everyone. And this came out very clearly when we were discussing in different aspects, especially looking at different discussion during the Convention on Biological Diversity and having different protocols, different other laws, which are supplementary to the main Convention on Biological Diversity. And I think one of the key areas where we saw a lot of success was with the Nagoya Protocol when we were discussing and negotiating it. Africa was at the forefront, and we really worked together to make sure that we could have those issues on the table and make sure that the protocol was able to really succeed and be signed in Nagoya in 2010. And looking at it is because we looked at the different resources that we have in Africa, especially on biodiversity and how important it is. And if we really make the laws and domesticate all the discussions that are done at the international level down to the ground, is very important because these resources are there and we need to make sure that they are equitably shared and really there is a good process in terms of looking at benefit sharing and so on, and on genetic resources and others. And this is why I'm saying it's very important, because at the same time, this particular protocol was able to really succeed in terms of recommending on the bicultural protocol, which is very, very important because this discussion was good enough to be able to make indigenous peoples and local communities visible. Because with the bicultural protocol, and I'm sure one of our presenters will be talking about it, help indigenous people to be able to understand further about their resources and how they can share them equally at different levels, which is very, very important. I'm bringing this up because when we look at biological diversity, we should also look at that nature and look at it and see how do we look at the nature and see how also the communities, how everybody can benefit at the same time, and how nature can benefit from us, and how we can look at it and look at it in a way that we use a human rights approach to be able to see that everything has its own place in terms of looking at different aspects of our development. Lately, we have been talking about the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, looking at how we have been looking at international level and also at the regional level, seeing how different people and different key players can be able to work together and come up with a strategy, a document that can help us, all of us, implement and conserve biodiversity and try to restore what has already been lost for many years and continue to be lost anyway without if people don't continue to really take action. And we as Indigenous people, we have also been working very hard to make sure that this particular discussion, we are collectively working together from different regions, from Africa, from different parts of countries of Africa, to make sure that we contribute in all areas of the strategic plan. We've just come, from Geneva discussing after a long time with a break, 2 years break because of the COVID pandemic. But the negotiations, even despite the fact that they were slower, but we were able to really make sure that the discussions was on the table and things brought up for discussion. And even if the work was not complete, there was a lot that was really discussed, and we were happy that we were able to talk about the issue of restoring nature and contributing, which is very important, to contributing to the people, and how also people can contribute to nature. So it's a two-way. It's not only one way, but it's a two-way of discussion. And also the issue of rights to a safeguard, clean and healthy environment, sustainable environment. Remember, all our countries, especially in Africa, we always have that in our constitution of a clean environment. But does it happen? Does it really happen? What can we do so that it can be visible and that we can have everyone playing that particular role? So the discussions there were really very important, and it was very important to look at how it's important to look at issues of equitable sharing, also equitable management of different resources. We did not forget also to discuss issues of our traditional knowledge, and looking at different areas where we were discussing about the goals, about the targets. We had different targets that we also discussed, and these targets were very important. Target 1 up to 2021, and also the recommendation that came up. And looking at issues of customary, like in target 1, we were really very keen, even though we were looking at to ensure that the fresh water, the natural, the marine and coastal areas of our different biodiversity are really integrated and also being able to be conserved. And we looked at issues of customary rights of Indigenous people and local communities, because this is, again, is very, very important. How did we as Indigenous people down on the ground, how did people really be able to conserve that? And the targets, really, we discussed quite a lot, and we were able to bring up some of the issues that were important to Indigenous people, telling the governments that it's very important to be able to recognize the rights of Indigenous people, look at the issues of free and prior informed consent to make sure that whatever is done at any time within the lands of Indigenous people, whether in freshwater, marine, or anything, that there is that free, prior informed consent of Indigenous people, which of course didn't go very well with the governments. Not many of them really supported it, but we know that slowly by slowly, this will be important to be able to be included in that particular document. And also looking at issues of financial resources, because there is nothing that we can be able to do without financial resources. Even if we have this strategy and we have this post-20 global framework, how will it be implemented? We want funding to go directly to Indigenous people so that they can continue taking up different activities and different projects and programs on their own, with their own funding. So Charles, these are things that are many, and if we discuss, I can discuss for hours, but I just want to say how much it is important for all of us to be able to work together and look at nature, not look at it as a side, but look at it as being part of us and we being part of it. And that's how we can advance issues of human rights. And a human rights approach is very important, and inclusiveness is very also important to make sure that we include everyone and work with everyone. Thank you, Charles, and maybe we can continue later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy. You will have a chance to expand on these ideas during the discussion. Thank you very much. Amelia, I'll hand over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Charles, so much, and just being part of this this very important discussion. It's now accepted that we are frightfully close to reaching the tipping point of our Earth, where we would no longer be able to reverse the effects of climate change. And as this realization is slowly building, so is citizens are looking at strong Western countries, at multinational corporations, and often at politicians to find some miraculous solution that will prevent a climate disaster, but also while maintaining the comfortable way of life and not addressing the real systemic changes that's needed. So really not disrupting the status quo. And whilst this increase while this is on the increase, there's also another movement that we see, and that's that many communities across the world, and Lucy laid such a good foundation of discussing that, many communities across the world have maintained a way of life that's closely connected and in harmony with nature. So the question is then, why is the world not looking to Indigenous peoples and local communities for the answer, especially as the urgency is now? The poster to this webinar says we are running out of time, and indeed we are. The recent IPCC report just further confirmed that our time really we are almost up. So today I want to share within this context about one legal empowerment tool, and again, Lucy touched on that briefly, called Biocultural Community Protocols, that places communities' biocultural rights at the center and also affirm these rights. Biocultural community protocols, also referred to as community protocols, sometimes just simply protocols, and for this discussion, I will use the abbreviation BCPs, are an articulation of community self-governance and values in a manner that's comprehensible to the outsiders. Indigenous peoples and communities have a rich bicultural heritage, which includes their customary laws, values, beliefs, governing specific territories, their territories of life. Their culture is intrinsically linked to their relationship with nature, and one cannot separate this from one another. BCPs have always been in existence in various forms. Some of them are oral, folklore, dance, but for the first time, as Lucy said, they received global recognition by being included in the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing, a protocol to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And within being included in the protocol, BCPs received recognition and recognized communities' value in stewarding biodiversity and being capable of self-governance. Other than the recognition in the Nagoya Protocol, we also see various other international frameworks such as the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that support BCPs. And then also national governments have exercised various efforts in recognizing BCPs. In South Africa, particular, BCPs are underpinned by robust legal frameworks such as NEMBA, the National Environmental Management Biodiversity Act, and the BABS regulations, which are the regulations to NEMBA, the Indigenous Knowledge Systems Act, and then also the Constitution, the latter which recognizes customary law. So with BCPs being recognized for the first time in the space of access and benefit sharing, it's been mostly used within that space, but we've also now seen further usage, just the importance of it in the extractive projects, which I'll get to a little bit later. And then also natural justice have used it in criminal law cases. So there are various ways in which BCPs can be used as a legal empowerment tool. So as a tool in terms of advancing the rights of nature and human rights, as I've said, community rights to nature cannot be seen as separate from their human rights, as these are interconnected. If we were to separate them, the solution to our climate disaster really will become a mismatch to the realities of communities. However, when we use BCPs, we don't romanticize communities. Communities in South Africa and Africa are not isolated, they're not homogeneous, and what constitutes a community is often very complex. We embarked on a process with a community and in South Africa on the West Coast, the Indigenous Kurikwa community, and the BCP, the process for them was really about redefining who they are, reclaiming their identity due to our past, apartheid. They've really become disconnected to who they are as peoples, and through the BCP process, they were able to reclaim that. And that is one of the greatest values of BCPs, and that the process which build them, which put them together, and move towards the articulation. And at Natural Justice, we've experienced that when assisting a community to assert their self-governance and values, communities also have an opportunity to then revisit their existing governance arrangements. They really have an opportunity to define who they are as a community in the past, now, and where do they want to be in the future? So how do they see their vision of community? And this process then places community as the owners of their own BCP, which outsiders should respect. And when organizations or agents from outside support communities, they should respect that communities are essentially the owners of the PCP, and that, you know, the role that they play is to assist, to guide, to facilitate. So looking a little bit at the process, communities obviously first have to make a decision to embark on a process to write down their BCP or in a form that they feel would have most value. And this decision is influenced by a number of factors. They can be either aspirational or defensive, or usually it's really a bit of both. But establishing why the community is embarking on the process is very important, as it also determines the priorities of the BCP. The process should be as close as possible married to the values of the community. An Indigenous development approach, one approach that looks at change from within, that's consultative, that's reflective, is empowering, and then will lead to a result that's closely connected to who the community is, and that's driven by the community members themselves. According then to these priorities that the community identified, the community will then set out their rights and responsibilities under national, customary, and international law as the basis for engaging with outsiders. Outsiders being governments, academics, NGOs, corporations, etc. And it's in this last step that it's crucial to the empowerment of the community, and often where NGOs or other organizations that's assisting communities can play a role in assisting communities to be able to assert these rights within a BCP. Because by highlighting the community rights within a BCP, outsiders such as corporations have to take the community rights into consideration. Lucy also spoke a little bit about free, prior, and informed consent, but I also just want to link it to bicultural community protocols. This principle is valuable and important, recognized international and a principle, and incorporated also in some national frameworks in South Africa and in Africa as well. And according to this process, to this principle, any legislative and administrative measure, development projects, or any activities that affect Indigenous peoples or local communities, culture, their history, their traditional knowledge, their lands, their territories, their natural resources, genetic resources, climate, environment, arts, historical and sacred sites, they require the free, prior, and informed consent from communities. Communities have the right to say yes, to say no, to hold or withhold consent to a specific project. And corporations intending then to embark on extractive projects, for example, oil and gas, have to obtain the consent from the communities that will be impacted by the projects. But all too often we see that projects just continue, either under the false pretense that consent was obtained, or countries just not adhering to this international principle at all, or just turning a blind eye. The recent development in the Okavango with regards to the exploration drilling for gas, it's quite a good example of that. Despite the Namibian national law holding processes that needs to be followed and put in place before exploration can be done, it clearly has, the country has not enforced those, and the international company that's currently drilling is continuing. And then recently in South Africa, we've seen two high courts, two interdicts that was brought on behalf of communities attempting to stop exploration for oil and gas through seismic surveys. In the case of Shell, and then also in Searcher, confirmed the importance of public participation, and the courts granted the interdicts as both companies failed in their duty to ensure that there was effective participation with communities that would be affected by the projects. In the latter case of Searcher, which was the exploration for the seismic survey on the west coast of South Africa, the BCP of the Gurikwa Indigenous community they based on the west coast, was included in the supporting affidavits of the applicants. And this BCP affirms the relationship that the Gurikwa peoples have with the sea, where the seismic survey was to be conducted. And also the affidavit confirmed to many of the other affidavits just the impact that these surveys would have on both the human rights, including the right to food and the right of nature of the community should the surveys go ahead. And it's just significant having this legal empowerment tool included, which articulates essentially the community's way of life that's so intrinsically linked to one another. So BCPs are important in the context of free, prior, and informed consent, as they set out how the communities ranged for purposes of consent. So the BCP itself doesn't give consent, but it says how can someone from the outside obtain consent from the community, and how should consent also be reached within the community. So as this movement is slowly accelerating that realizes Indigenous peoples and local communities' way of life, that it's one of the best ways to conserve biodiversity and cultural diversity, BCPs can play an immense and important role supporting communities to be able to articulate their way of life and also essentially bring the table to the communities for discussion around climate solutions. Thanks, Charles.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Thank you very much. Pooven, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Charles. And just to say, I am unfortunately at an airport to do some strange people behind me or announcements being made. Apologies in advance. So Lucy and Amelia have covered a lot. So I'm just going to build on some of that. You know, and starting, I think Amelia mentioned the IPCC report. You know, I mean, there were a few things from that. A is that, you know, we certainly don't have time. B is that, you know, we're heading for 3.2 degrees, you know, based on our current trajectory. And what we know outside of the report is that, you know, there's a massive push, especially in Africa, around fossil fuels, you know, oil and gas exploration across the continent. To at least in South Africa, so we know, you know, what the science is saying, and we know what the reality is. And over the last, you know, couple of weeks, I also had the opportunity to spend time with different Indigenous wisdom peoples from across different parts of the globe, and them sharing, you know, the prophecies, you know, from their traditions. But also this time that we find ourselves in, you know, and a big part of it is, you know, this idea, which both Lucy and Amelia referred to, is the interconnectedness of everything. And until we get to that point of this interconnectedness, you know, we're always going to be in trouble because we can't afford, you know, that the kind of level of separation that is there, and systematically, you know, is being enforced. And a big part of, you know, what we need to do is, you know, the decolonization process. It's unlearning, you know, the things we've learned or the things that have been forced upon us. You know, and part of this is how we see, you know, us being part of nature, and then looking at the question of, you know, the rights of nature. And the first point I want to make is that, and Lucy alluded to this, is that we can't, you know, see the rights of nature as something separate from everything else, because we, again, you know, then get into that aspect of you know, boxing things, and you know, it's not going to serve us or anyone. And so it's really important when we're talking about the rights of nature to also to talk about human rights, and the interconnection between those. And, you know, if we're looking at sustainability, looking at, you know, how do we, you know, protect the nature, we have to look at how we protect people in terms of rights violation as well. So looking at that interconnectedness, I'm just coming from a meeting now, you know, that was discussing how do we, well, two things around the right to a healthy environment. A, that there was this massive resolution passed by the Human Rights Council recognizing the right to a healthy and safe environment as a human right, which is a massive step forward. And now, we were having discussions about, getting that passed at the General Assembly so that it's, accepted at that level and becomes, more possible. So at the same time, looking at, how does this get implemented? Because, you can have all of these legal frameworks, etc. But ultimately, if it's not implemented, then what's the point? But the key thing about the right to a healthy environment is ensuring that the environment is protected in a way, that the interface between humans and nature is one that is healthy. So it does kind of push on issues like ensuring there isn't pollution, the toxicity that we put into the water, into the land, etc. That all of that starts to shift. And so, looking at South Africa, we have Section 24 of our Constitution that talks about the fact that everyone has a right to an environment that's not harmful to the health or well-being of people. But also it talks about having an environment that's protected for the benefit of present and future generations. And it talks specifically about preventing pollution, degradation, and promoting the conservation as well. So, it's something that's very much entrenched in our constitution. And, we also have Section 31 of the Constitution, which talks about culture, religion, and language, etc. And there is a key connection there, which I'll speak to now. But underneath the Constitution, we have a range of laws and kind of frameworks. The National Environment Management Act, Biodiversity Act, the Coastal Management Act, the National Water Act, the Heritage Act, the Interim Protection of Informal Land Rights for Indigenous Communities, etc. So there's a whole spectrum, of laws that speak to this part of the Constitution. The challenge, however, is, and as we've seen in practice, is, having laws is one thing, but, ensuring that there's enforcement, often means, communities, civil society organizations having to go to courts to make sure, that rights are protected. The Shell case is just one example of that. But a key thing about the Shell case was, the Judge Broom, really listened to what communities were saying about their connection to the ocean, their connection to the land. It's that, cultural connection, spiritual connection, and so on. And in a way, it's starting to shift, how we see this. And the fact that, some of that is happening through courts, is one thing, but it's, how do we ensure the kind of discourse, the understanding and the awareness is much broader than, when we're challenging something in court. So, to say the rights of nature is very much linked to the rights to a healthy environment, but also the rights of future generations, because that's a key part of this. And then the other aspect is looking at culture and connection, to the earth. So those are some of the fundamental things. But also to say that there have been many lawsuits, constitutional changes in several countries. And, there's also been a move around looking at the question of ecocide. And there's now a draft legal definition by ICC jurists, looking at rights of nature and the link into criminal law, around this. And so many courts and legislatures are increasingly, extending the kind of legal personhood to rivers, water tables, oceans, forests, ecosystems, and basically granting them a defendable right not to be harmed, which is absolutely crucial. But it also brings forward, the enforceable duty of care towards nature, which is absolutely crucial. And so, you know, it's again this kind of interconnection, and Amelia spoke about, you know, also the Western kind of legal frameworks, which has a very specific, you know, worldview that's been a massive barrier, you know, within the kind of laws, policies, etc. And so, just briefly to say, so, you know, ecocide as a draft definition is the unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's substantial likelihood um, of severe long-term damage to the environment being caused by these acts. And the purpose of starting, you know, this kind of move is basically to get the Rome Statute of the ICC amended. And so, you know, we have provisions around like genocide, crimes against humanity, and the idea is to add this one, ecocide, you know, to the Rome statutes. But also to say that, you know, in several countries, and many of you may have heard of some of this anyway, but like in 2017, the New Zealand Parliament granted personhood to the Whanganui River. That's, you know, the Maori people have a spiritual and cultural you know, connection to. In 2019, the High Court in Bangladesh recognized the Tuareg River as a legal entity with rights. But I think one of the key, you know, examples is, and this was a long time ago, in 2008, you know, Ecuador became the first country to enshrine in its constitution the rights of Pachamama, or Mother Earth, and this was a massive step forward. And there's many other examples in Pakistan, US, India, and so on. But the challenge again is, you know, the question of you may have this like in Ecuador constitution, but given the, you know, for example, mining interests in 2017, there was concession for about you know, mining across about 2.9 million hectares in protected areas, indigenous territories, and biodiversity hotspots. So, you know, even though it's there in the constitution, it doesn't mean in practice, you know, everything is guaranteed, and it, you know, requires constant, you know, challenge and kind of public pressure, you know, around some of these issues. The other problem is, you know, like with Ganga or the Ganges River in India, which, you know, the court also there was a judgment around the rights of this river. But the challenge often is enforcement, you know, of court decisions, because, you know, often it's people who are, you know, perpetuating the kind of issues are the ones that are being asked to, you know, enforce these court judgments. And again, you know, ultimately, in speaking, you know, to some of the issues that Amelia raised, ultimately it will be communities that hold you know, governments or corporations accountable. And so it's really important for communities to be in a position to make sure, you know, whether it's court decisions or laws, etc., you know, that these violations are, you know, certainly being challenged. And, you know, I can go on with examples where, you know, for example, in Minnesota, the Ojibwe people, you know, challenged on the grounds of the rights of nature for oil pipelines that were being built and the amount of water that was being consumed, you know, during this period, and how that violated the rights of wild rice, which was a fascinating, you know, case as well. But, you know, just to start wrapping up, I think, you know, biocultural community rights are really important. You know, looking at traditions that honors land and biodiversity, looking at preserving, respecting land, protecting local ecosystems, and, you know, living in a symbiotic manner. There was a case in Colombia, the Futures case, where, you know, there was massive logging in the Amazon. Communities, you know, stood up, went to court, and it was really interesting judgment because, you know, the judge both at the rights of nature, but also looked at the rights of indigenous communities and how those are, so connected. And there was a judgment in favor of protecting, at least that part of the Amazon. But back at home, I mean, there's people, activists doing incredible work. So in Patileni, as an example, from the Venda region, has been working with other community members to really protect, Lake Funditsi, the Venda forests. And these are sacred forests to communities there. And they have this, incredible relationship, and don't see the lake or the forest as as products, but really as living beings. And I think the type of work activists like her and others are doing, are really crucial. There's also been, recently in South Africa, the Philippine horticultural area, the case where the aquifer was seen as really crucial and that needed to be protected, and then the Shell case where the interconnection between people and the sacredness of the oceans and land. There's several other cases where different aspects of the rights of nature have started to emerge, but also there's been a lot of work done by COMA, for example, looking at wildlaw, etc. But I'll end by saying, beyond the policy and litigation, there has to be a broader shift in how we perceive, experience nature. And I think we have to, as part of that decolonization process, really, immerse ourselves more in the indigenous wisdom that's being put forward, going back to, key principles like respect in terms of each other as human beings, but also respect for, other parts of nature, etc. So I'll end. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Pooven, and thank you very much to our panelists. We are now going to open it up for a discussion. So if you want to speak, please raise your hand. You will be allowed to speak. You can also feel free to write your comments or questions in the chat. But to make it much more interactive, please feel free to raise your hand and speak. I see there are several questions in the chat that have been raised by Vishwa Sadka. The first question is, can an entire country like South Africa have a BCP? The second question is, how do we strengthen the legal efficacy of BCPs? And the third question is, have court judgments assisted in Kenya and in other places? And Vish is also asking Amelia if you can say more about the Endorai case. If any of our panelists wants to go first.
Charles, I'm happy to go first, and then perhaps if some of the other panelists have to add. So there's, as you said, there's three components of three questions essentially. Maybe to start with the first one, how do we strengthen BCP? So as I think I wrote and put in the chat, but I'm not sure if everyone can see that. But as BCPs are, increasingly being used by communities to affirm their rights, momentum is built. We've seen that. This article, which was in 2010, BCPs have not been used as often as they can, and also as they should. And the more they are used, the more opportunities it creates. They are respected much more. They are seen as valuable. And it's just, we've seen now here in South Africa, it's really like this momentum. So, currently, there's been much more recognition of BCPs. And with that, on the one side, there's recognition by outside actors. We also see much more community interest and communities asking, requesting, can you assist us to develop this? Is that possible? So it's kind of, I just see it as both, as it is more used, momentum is built, and it's much more recognized, and then through that it's also obviously strengthened, because we are still at a point where we are, pushing the boundaries and seeing, what can this tool, mean to us, and then also just to the question, can an entire country like South Africa have a BCP? So we in a different in a project we looked at, could we develop possibly for specific species, and in the space of access and benefit sharing, could we develop a BCP for regional species that are found across South Africa? And yes, it is possible, but the real value of BCPs is in the fact that it really brings a community together, and it contains that uniqueness and that relationship that the community has with the land, and also with their culture, so the biocultural rights aspect. And that, I feel, to some extent would be completely lost if one would embark on, for example, the South Africa-wide BCP. One wouldn't be able to really include all of that richness. What we saw in the project, where we took the natural resource and brought together communities to see whether, for purposes of access and benefit sharing, one could create a BCP or a similar legal instrument for these communities. We saw that communities actually still have to walk that road within the community. So they have to do, if one really wants to be effective, they have to have BCPs at a community level, and then one can bring that to a national level or to a regional level. Thanks.
Charles, I just wanted to comment on what Amelia has talked about on BCPs, and why are they so important also is because working on BCPs here in Kenya, I've realized that also makes the Indigenous communities and to understand more about legal issues and policies that we have within the country, because they are able then to relate it and to be able to include it in it. At the same time, because in the PCPs, it's also important to bring in the government and to bring in some of the laws. It's also a way that when the government officials or people working around those areas look at those BCPs and read them, they kind of understand the communities more and understand how the institution of the Indigenous people customary way of life. And there is also one important thing that I remember in the discussion with the Convention on Biological Diversity, those BCPs that are already complete, and with the FPIC of the Indigenous communities, it's important that they are also shared in the clearinghouse in the process of the CBD, so that others can also look and see. Why is it important? Because it also helps, like when we have a business or private sector that is interested in some of the resources, then they also look at these BCPs and understand them and know what kind of resources are within, and who are the people and who are the leaders, and how to be able to what is the entry point for them to get into those communities, and how is it done, and so on. So it's quite an important instrument that I think, to me, if this is developed among many Indigenous people, then it can really bring a lot of change, especially in terms of conserving our resources, conserving and protecting our resources. Thank you. And I think there was a question on Kenya, but I think Pooven has already answered it. Thank you on the chat.
Yeah, maybe if I can just add on the Bashir question around the Indigenous case. I mean, just to point out a couple of things. I think one is that, there are, let's say, legal mechanisms outside of the country. There have been many cases that have been lost in a country, but basically those cases were taken, to a regional level, and the Indigenous case was case in point. The challenge, as I spoke about, some of the other cases, and like the Indigenous case, there's certain levels of recognition, etc., and key principles, that are established. The challenge was the implementation, and the Indigenous people have for many, for a decade now, been trying to, get some of these things, enforced, and it's been, ongoing battle and challenge. But again, the key thing here is that, the community themselves other ones, holding government to account for the implementation. And I think that's an absolutely crucial part of it. But also, another example is we currently in the East Africa's Court of Justice challenging what would be the longest oil pipeline on the planet, to the oil pipeline. So that cuts oil from Uganda, that cuts through Uganda, Tanzania, across indigenous communities, across biodiverse hotspots, etc. And again, part of the challenge is going to the regional level and the regional court. But ultimately, in terms of implementation, it comes back to within country and so on. And that's something one needs to look at. The other aspect is in terms of rights of nature is looking at again the interconnectedness across geography. Because rivers cut across several countries. As an example. So looking at the legal side of what does that mean, given that you may be trying to protect something in one country or one area, but how do we ensure protection across ecosystems, etc. Is something that is still developing, but that's something that's to think about.
Thank you very much to our panelists. Laura Foster, please unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks. This question's for Pooven. I was wondering, you talked about different case law to establish rights of nature. It seems like there's a rights of nature implied in several different legislative pieces in South Africa. What other campaigns are going on? Is there a campaign to kind of establish a sort of an explicit policy on the rights of nature in South Africa, or is that happening mostly at the international level right now?
Yeah, thanks, Laura, for the question. I think there's in South Africa there's been different initiatives, and I refer to some of it, like the work that Cormac Cullinan and others are doing, in terms of the thinking. But I think it's kind of reaching a point where all of the different pieces or different strands are starting, to come together, and those being what's happening in the ports and getting to a point where one takes a very specific case to court that sets a precedent around the rights of nature. So on the legal side, I think there's some moves there to while different pieces have emerged in different cases, to look at a case that specifically deals with the issue of rights to nature. On the legal side, I think that's one aspect. On the, let's say, academic side, I think several people have been and continue to look at the issue. There's also some moves, in place to set up some kind of structure to pull these different parts together as well. But but I think ultimately what it does require is, and kind of what I ended by saying, it requires some kind of impetus movement, some big push, and the energy that's required to to bring this to the fore, because it's been on the sidelines, and I think the time is right there. If ever there was a time, that time is now. And I think similar to some of the other campaigns that have emerged, including how amazing people got together, around the Shell issue as an example. I do think we have to be very proactive, and this shouldn't just be lawyers, etc., but it should be a broad spectrum of people that come together and push these issues, and hopefully this platform will help to elevate it and continue to add energy to that kind of process.
very much, Pooven. Mashiashi, Phineas, please unmute yourself.
Unmute, okay? Yeah. My question is on the balance of the human rights and the nature rights with respect to the problem which is existing now in Xolobeni, the Amadiba community, where you find that the scent, which is supposed to produce food for them and also for survival of other nature, part of nature, is the one which is supposed to be taken as titanium scent to be used for other things, as it ought to be mined. And then when you mine it, their source of living is removed. So how can you balance such rights if the balance is necessary? Thank you.
Thanks so much for the question. Maybe if I can start and then the others will come in. I mean, just to say a few things, I think, about the Amadiba community. It's just been so inspiring over the years, to see what's happened, despite the struggles and the challenges. But there's a couple of, key things. One is, the case a couple of years ago, around free, prior, informed consent, which, was massive in terms of South Africa setting precedent around that. And, again, I think that links both to, obviously having that kind of consent from communities, but that's also a layer of protection, for the environment or for nature. And that was a really important judgment. The second thing to say is, a few years ago, and I spent a week there, it was really incredible to see at that point, and I think it was really well said, how, the kind of local, traditional leaders, healers, on the one hand, were doing ceremonies and on the sand dunes. And at the same time, activist convening, and how those two streams had come together. And it was such a significant moment, for me personally, but also, just seeing how these parts are coming together, the activism, but also the kind of indigenous knowledge. And over the years, with the ecotourism and what the community wants in terms of looking at, on the one hand, having an economic income from ecotourism, from farming, and so on, and in that way also protecting what's there. And that was a key part of the Shell case as well. Arguing that oil and gas exploration, besides the damage to the environment, would also cause harm to the community in terms, from a kind of economic perspective, because of tourism and so on. So ultimately, as you were saying, I think it is about finding a balance, and a balance in ensuring whatever is done sustainably. Because I mean, if the mining went ahead, basically it becomes a mining town, and we've seen mining towns in South Africa, how people's lives are decimated, how the rivers are polluted, and health issues start to arise, and so on. And so finding alternative ways of ensuring this is income, ensuring that everything's done as best as can, in a sustainable way. I think it's important. But as you say, it's not just a question of balance, but it's about the one feeding into the other. So the rights of community and the rights of nature.
Thank you very much, Pooven. Colleagues, are there other questions and comments? We are also trying to be very, very timers. Shadrach, please unmute yourself. Shadrach, please unmute yourself. Your head was up, unless it was a mistake.
Charles.
Yes, comrade.
Thank you very much, leadership. Thank you very much, everybody. No, mine is not too. I think the panelists have been quite clear on several important issues. Mine here is for those that, because I think Jane is in a very good position, maybe including you, Charles, a good position to confirm that I've been for a very long time with you, from maybe 2019. You know, because we are in the rural areas here, and we are not visible. I think Ms. Heyns was very correct in saying that we need to have structures. And I think even last year, in the second quarter, we spoke about the issue of reaching our communities to have structures. If we check our minutes, we'll be able to see that we have agreed that we need to reach our community, to have structures in our communities, so that the people are able to, like, where I'm living here and surrounding areas. If you tell people, at least these ones, because I'm here, about climate change, they know nothing about that. They don't even know. When we start talking about that, some only knew about it when we have started, you know, they see our activities, especially, Charles will agree with me, the one in April last year, during the World Food Day. That's when people started to know about climate change, what is climate change, and so forth and so forth. So there is a lot of work that we really need to do. I think Ms. Heyns and Mulenkei, I can't really pronounce the name, surname correctly, but I think they've raised very serious aspects in relation to indigenous people, which is where we are living. We've got a problem. People are still burning. They don't know burning, you know, whatever that they clean in their yard and whatever that, you know, you can call or like to call it that affects the climate. So I think we really need to reach our community. The fact that really I need to raise, and also Charles, the fact that I'm a student. I understand Versus assisting us. I know Versus assisting us. In fact, Versus is one of the institutions of higher, you know, this education, which are in the forefront, assisting, working with us around our goal. So I wanted to, because I'm also a first-year student in CPUT, Cape Peninsula University of Technology in Cape Town. I wanted to know whether we also working with that particular institution, and if not, how can we earn some there? How can we work with them? Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Comrade Shadrach. As Comrade Vishal Sadka does the wrap up, as well as the next session, he will respond to you and the concerns that you have raised. As for me, is to say a great deal of thank you to our great panelists, Lucy, Amelia, and Pooven. Thank you very much. Before I hand over to Vish, as we move on to our next session, I just want to call on everyone on Earth Day, 22nd of April. We are calling on all activists to take a stand in their communities against all war, to host a local action, a picket, information session, whatever action best expresses their opposition to all war on Earth. And we invite all activists and organizations planning to host an action to fill out our Google form, telling us what type of action they will be holding and times and so forth. I'm going to share the Google form in the chat. I'll also share in the chat the link to the CJCM webinar on Earth Day. I'll also share in the chat the petition. Thank you very much, Comrade Vish. I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, big thank you to the panel and thank you, Charles. I have bad reception, so I'm not putting my video on. I'm just going to facilitate sort of discussion around the flooding and in KZN and the discussions we've been having since this morning with activists in the province, in the COPAC space and the broader CJCM around how we respond. And I'm going to share that response in this meeting to get some feedback from you. I'll also just make some concluding remarks after this. So in our consultations, we felt that it was very important to challenge the narrative currently in the country. There isn't a connection being made to climate by the politicians, whether it's the Premier, Sihle Zikalala, whether it's the Mayor of the city of Durban, and of course, the State President is flying in now, but he's been to KZN previously when disaster struck. And again, not much was made of the connection to climate. And we feel we really need to challenge the narrative. This is not a natural disaster that just happened. The other point we want to make is that, you know, and Pooven, you mentioned ecocide. There's a legal definition now, which really relates to the mass destruction of human and non-human life. And we use the concept a lot in the charter process, in our activism, etc. And for us, the flooding in KZN is an example of ecocide. And it's got to do with political leadership failing to take on this challenge. And so this is what we are calling for. We are calling for the charging of the president, relevant ministers, the deputy chairperson of the Presidential Climate Commission, the premier of KZN, and the mayor of eThekwini Metro with culpable homicide. So we consulted 2 lawyers this morning as well about what is the best line of legal attack. Will it be murder or will it be culpable homicide? It's a pity we don't have ecocide within our laws. The South African government has failed to take the climate crisis seriously, and we kind of underline this point, given that it's been part of the UN climate process for almost 3 decades, but yet it has not really put forward anything serious to protect society. It's also a signatory to IPCC reports, the 3 that have been released as part of the 6th cycle of reporting. The Physical Science Basis report last year affirming that we are living in a world of climate extremes, and attribution is very clear about that. We also have the 2 recent reports, the recent one being mitigation, again, confirming the need for urgent climate action, but again, the government is not acting. We're also seeing in lived reality a pattern of destruction, including in KZN. The La Nina-induced drought, we've seen tornadoes, we've seen floods. 2019, there was a serious flood that killed over 80 people. And again, beginning of this year, Ladysmith was devastated and so on. So the current flash flood currently, formerly in the public domain, the number notched up sadly is 59 people. And again, we are standing with the victims of this failure, of this climate injustice, and with their families, and we're extending our solidarity and our love to them. But we again clarifying this is not a national disaster, natural disaster. This has got to do with the failure of political leadership to take the urgencies of the climate crisis seriously. We are saying that this is a climate injustice, and that, you know, instead of all the corruption and the state failure, etc., we should have had a government basically driving the deep, just transition and helping us adapt, mitigate, and ensure that harms are lessened to our society. But we're also affirming our own activism. And, you know, since October 2018, together with 60 other organizations, over 60, we called for an emergency sitting of Parliament when the 1.5 degrees Celsius report was issued. And again, we were ignored. In April 2019, during the floods in KZN, we called for a climate emergency to be declared in the country, for the country to be placed on a climate emergency footing. We were ignored. In 2020, we took the Climate Justice Charter, a climate science document prepared by our leading climate scientists, and a memorandum from communities wanting to ensure an end to hunger, thirst, pollution, and climate harm. Again, we've been ignored. We reiterated this call last year when we went to Parliament again in November. And essentially, the government is just not listening and is rather choosing to reproduce the carbon-based minerals energy complex. So we further argue that essentially it's a carbon criminal state and it's pursuing its gas and oil interests, and essentially is taking us down a destructive path, an ecocidal path. So it's in that context, and we're using this platform as well to call on all climate activists across the country to go to the nearest police station to lay charges against the President, the Minister of Energy and Mineral Resources, Gwede Mantashe, the Minister of Fisheries, Forestry and Environment, Barbara Creasy, Vali Musa, the Deputy Chair of the Presidential Climate Commission, the KZN Premier, the eThekwini Metro Mayor, for culpable homicide related to those that have been killed during the flood. Culpable homicide is the unlawful and negligent killing of another human being. And we believe that the unlawful aspect relates to breaching the Paris Climate Agreement and, of course, our Constitution, which provides for us to have a safe environment. And it is negligent because they just have not acted given the science, given what they know as a state around the worsening climate crisis. So tomorrow in Johannesburg at 11 o'clock, Charles Simane and Awande Buthelezi will be leading with whoever climate justice activists join them, Johannesburg Central Police Station, 1 Commissioner Street, to go and lay these charges. Janet Solomon from Oceans Not Oil and other activists in KZN will be going to the Mayville South African Police Services office on 145 Jan Smuts Highway. We're also demanding a meeting with Shamila Batoy to discuss these charges. So this is our response, to the current flooding, which for us is the climate shock, bringing great climate injustice. And we wanted to share with this platform, invite some input and comment, and also ask activists to step up and join us tomorrow when we go to police stations. It's open for some comment, Charles, before I wrap up.
Comrades and colleagues would definitely love your feedback. You can raise your hand and you will be allowed to speak. Yes, Comrade Shadrack, unmute yourself.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Comrade Charles. I wanted to ask if in case we wanted to, as you guys are tomorrow going to John Foster in Johannesburg, to ask if we want to, or rather intending to, or have the intention to go to the nearest police station and also lay such criminal charges. What information do we need? If there is any information, are you going to then assist us with the search? And if there is any support, is there any support that you're going to give us whilst going there? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Comrade Shadrack. Vish?
Yeah, no, we will be sharing this document. And in this meeting, we wanted to invite activists to put up their hands in terms of if they want to go to a police station and so on. We don't have resources to resource people to go there en masse, but we can definitely put your activity on this press release. We're going to be sending it out tonight at 7. And we're hoping to get some media attention when activists go to particular police stations. Yeah. So comrades, go to police stations. I think that's the message. And we can share this release with everyone who's attended here today and on all our other social media platforms.
Please, through you, Mr. Simane, that we can we please get such an information at your disposal and look at it and see what we can do in that regard. Thank you very much.
We will share the document that Vish was presenting with everyone who is in attendance. I see your comment, Comrade Phineas. My comment is that such class action is very necessary. Is it a question? Phineas, I can allow you to speak. Okay.
No, I think, Charles, it's an affirmation from Phineas. I think that's welcome. I think Alan also makes an important point. Yes, Alan, when we consulted lawyers this morning, initially we were trying to use murder as a line of attack, but they advised us to use culpable homicide, particularly around the negligence issue as well. Both for national government, both provincial, as well as local government. I mean, the failure to put in place mitigation plans, adaptation plans, etc. I mean, for almost 30 years, this government has known about the climate problem, has known about the climate science, has been part of multilateral processes, and is doing nothing to deal with this problem. So yeah, I think that's where we're coming from. Charles, if there aren't any other comments, we, as agreed, we'll share this with comrades. We'll put this out on all our social media platforms. Comrades, get in touch with us to let us know if you're going to police stations. The more activists that go, the better. There are going to be more climate shocks, comrades. There's going to be worse floods. There's going to be worse droughts. There's going to be worse heat waves. There's going to be tornadoes. There's going to be cyclones that land. Actually, the debate is open in the scientific community about whether this was a cyclone or an extreme tropical storm or what is it. So we need to act now, and we need to draw red lines, comrades. This is very, very important. It's in that context that the rights of nature perspective is very, very important. And I think today's panel built on the panel we had last week with Wild Law, which basically affirmed that the rights of nature is both for humans and non-humans, but also for ecosystems. It also affirmed a critique of, if you like, anthropocentric and anti-nature ways of thinking. Rights of nature recognizes the intrinsic value of all living and life forms. And that was coming through in the panel even today. And there's a lovely continuity. I think the other important point about last week's panel, which pulls through today, was the importance of indigenous communities and the idea of recognizing, affirming, and validating the knowledge of indigenous communities. And in this panel, I think what was really novel was the idea of a biocultural protocol. And that was very valuable. And thank you for sharing those insights, both in terms of what's happened in Kenya and what's happening in other parts of the world, and what we can do here in the South African context. And I think in terms of the policy we're developing based on the Climate Justice Charter, this is an idea that will definitely pull through. And I think in some of the exchange we've had, it's clear that local democracy, local biocultural protocols are very, very important. The other important issue that came through was the right to a healthy environment. And, Pooven's part of this conference. And again, how do we push the boundaries of our constitution in the midst of COVID? I mean, how do we start making the connections to the bigger crisis that's coming and unfolding, which is the climate crisis? Climate crisis is a health crisis. It's also important that we have an environment that can sustain us. Again, we're at a frontier here in terms of pushing and testing our South African constitution. The other important point that was made was around the legal definition of ecocide. And again, it'll be nice to pursue this maybe with natural justice outside of this platform. But what are the implications of this? Will it be inscribed into the International Criminal Court stuff? With South Africa being a signatory, can we charge the rulers of this country for ecocide? Should we be working on a law that we promote around ecocide and so on? I think the other important issue that came up was the importance to learn from other international experiences. There are rights being conferred on other life forms, rivers, mountains, etc. Again, how do we pull that through? Chile right now is in a constitution-making process, and they are leaning towards the rights of nature as a crucial thrust in their constitution. Our hope was that if the South African Parliament adopted the Climate Justice Charter as per Section 234, which provides for charters to be adopted, we would have taken our constitution a little further beyond its 20th century kind of industrial frame and understanding of rights. We would have taken it in a greener direction, in a more ecological direction, but unfortunately that hasn't been realized. Once again, a very, very big thank you to our panelists, Pooven, Amelia, and Lucy. Your time and your input is very much appreciated and it has enriched all of us. Thank you to all attendees that came through. Thank you to Charles and the COPAC team for convening us. And of course, just to remind you about activism, tomorrow, if you can go to a police station, we'll be sharing our call with you, and you can use that as the basis to put the charges through on culpable homicide. There's the petition that we put out. Please sign it, share it amongst your networks. We're taking this petition to the COP summit in Egypt at the end of the year. And the South African state is a pariah state. It is not a climate justice state. It is not supportive of other African countries, let alone the most vulnerable on our planet. So please sign the petition. And then, of course, join us on April 22nd. Our call is End All War, denuclearize, demilitarize. We're at a very important turning point in human history. We could end up militarizing the world with the Third World War or with the Third Cold War, rather than solving the more serious problem, which is the climate crisis. And we also are saying, let's end the war with nature. So please join us on that day, take up local actions, workshops, sit-ins, whatever it is, placard demonstrations, paint murals, have theater. Let us know what you're doing. And then, of course, join our assembly that afternoon. That assembly is being co-hosted also with Ocean Not Oil activist Setsi Masifundise, and we'll be deepening this discussion about the rights of nature, but we'll be talking about how do we defend the ocean commons. So that's the sort of activist imperatives for the next few days. And again, thank you to everybody for attending.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.